Good morning, everybody. It is Sunday morning. It is January 12th, 2025. My name is 12 Gauge, and this is my channel, 12 Gauge Investigative. I thought I'd hop on here and do a recording rather than a live because for some reason, recordings go a little better, uploads go a little better because it allows you to focus on the material rather than focusing on trying to maintain the chat, trying to maintain the questions that are being asked and things like that. Um, Especially in this case, because as I've specified before in numerous chats, and especially in one yesterday, my channel is different than most of the other channels that you see on True Crime on YouTube. My channel is mostly to educate, to deep dive into the psychological aspect of the criminal mind, the investigative process, and so on and so on. So whenever I present something live, it's quite difficult to be answering questions that have nothing to do with the deep dive, especially if they're questions that have been circulated throughout the years of this crime. I thought I'd go back and since I watched this channel, the interview room, there's two individuals on this panel that you're going to see that are very insightful that I respect immensely. You might have opinions on them, and that's fine. But I seem to enjoy how they break down the information, the education part of it, the evidence part of it. The one is Chris, and the other one is Dr. Gary Mercado. And there's some other experts on this panel that are going to break down the profile of this killer before a killer was even arrested. This interview was done, or this panel was comprised on December 25th, 2022. So they were already profiling someone. And I'm going to comment on their knowledge of this crime. So here we go.
I am grateful to have this panel put together here this evening, and call them friends. We are all on the Cold Case Foundation, and as you can see, some are wearing their swag, and Anne's in her Christmas sweater, which I know she's going to win whatever prizes are coming her way. But let me tell you a little bit about this panel that's been assembled here this evening, everybody. First of all, I want to welcome Dr. Ann Burgess in the middle there. We're honored to have Ann with us again. The highly acclaimed Netflix series Mindhunter was based on the fictional character of Dr. Wendy Carr, directly off the very real Ann Burgess. And Ann is currently a Boston College professor. She's a pioneer in assessing and treating trauma victims. She and FBI agent John Douglas developed a new type of criminal profiling of notorious serial killers when the behavior science unit first originated. She and John collaborated for over a decade. John Douglas wrote about their work in his renowned book, Mindhunter, inside the FBI's elite serial crime unit. His book was the basis of the fictionalized Netflix series Mindhunter. John was one of those writers, as well as Anne participated in assisting in that series. The TV series ran from 2017 to 2019, and it got amazing rave reviews internationally. We're thrilled again this evening, and I'm thrilled that she's here and to call her a friend, to have one of the original Mindhunters this evening, Dr. Ann Burgess. Welcome, Ann.
Thank you. Well, when we look at this case, what do we know? What do we hear? And again, we're only going on information that has been released, very little. But this is a case where, and from the victim's standpoint, it's a blitz style. A blitz style means that there is no prior interaction before. In other words, victim and offender don't talk, don't do anything. It's in the middle of the night. It's
Okay, so I like how she breaks that down, the blitz style. There's no interaction between victim and offender. And we later find out that, the prosecutor blurted out a particular statement about no stalking. And people seem to hold on to that with everything they are. And there's nothing wrong with that. But it's interesting how she immediately points this out.
It's in a room that we presume is dark. We've had no information that lights were on or anything like that. So we want to ask, well, what type of personality would do this, that would take a very vulnerable victim, two victims actually, and kill them as they did in a matter of hours? So it's not someone that's going to be very extrovert, in my opinion, because it's not.
And let me reiterate, the reason she said hours is because at this point, they had changed the timeline multiple times. They had started the timeline at between 2 and 4, and then they jumped it up to about 3:30 to 4, so I can only assume that's why she was talking about hours. It's not that she's misinformed or anything like that. I can only assume that she's talking about that because of that.
Not like a Ted Bundy kind of thing. And I have to go on the data that I have, which was with serial killers, and the ones that we looked at. And that tells me that it's not going to be someone that's really good, that interacts that well with people. So I suspect.
And that's interesting also because that's what we've heard in the very beginning about this individual. And you can say what you want about mainstream media, but without them, we wouldn't have even had any information about this person. Even if it seemed biased in some sort, we wouldn't have had any information about him. So those statements that he was creepy, he was odd, he had a very intense stare, all that coincide with what she just said.
And would say that he's isolated. I think it's a he. I do not think it's a she. And has to have complete control over a victim that's sleeping and is in the most vulnerable position, is in bed, sleeping, so to speak. So from a personality standpoint, I would say that's where I would start. There certainly could be, anything's possible, but it really looks, in my opinion, like it's one person. To have two people or more than, unless it was like a gang. I mean, sometimes you hear these horrendous things on gangs, but it doesn't in any way seem to have that part to it. So I would say it's one person who has had the house under surveillance, or had the victims under surveillance, and knows to some degree what their routine is, so to speak. That he has planned it. I absolutely agree with what Greg has said, has planned it. And the dark is very important. I think Gary really emphasized.
So she's talking about he had planned this. And as you've heard me read Dr. Bricato's book on the category 16. These type of killers, they're very meticulous, they're patient, and they have the ability to sit there and meticulously plan something out. So her saying that is quite interesting because this was before they even mentioned Koberger's name or anything about him.
That he commits this in the dark has a certain importance to it that he can't see, doesn't want to see, or I don't know, turns the lights on. We don't even know that if the lights get turned on at any point in this. It seems hard unless there was the moon out. I don't know whether they have checked on how bright was it outside.
Well, later, with all the photos and the videos and people's accounts of being able to see inside that home, we have noticed that there was lights on. We have noticed that there was lights on the patio, that there were lights along the first window right there to the right of the slider. There was obviously lights on in the living room area, that they were strung up because we have seen pictures where the living room area was semi-illuminated. The same thing with the good vibes sign that illuminated that area. So we do know that it wasn't extremely a dark crime scene.
I'd like to know that. So sometimes you can get a very full moon and get some light coming in.
Mhm.
But he had to have known enough about these the location of the rooms to get where he got to, and at least get to 2 floors. Why didn't he did he let 2 of the victims go in the first floor? Why didn't he let one of the victims' rooms go? We don't know. But
And once again, she's going off information, I'm sure, from the very beginning, because we're told that Dylan was on the first floor with Bethany, which we later found out was not true, that she was actually on the second floor. And I believe that that was strategic by the police to protect her during the time that they were looking for this individual. Because if he was capable enough to come into a home and do the type of damage that he did, then her safety was at risk. The same thing with Bethany's. I mean, so they were giving out clues that were partially true, I'm sure, but they weren't giving out clues to alert the killer that they were on to him or her. As she states, she believed at this point it was a him. And, you know, a lot of individuals, based on their statements, have identified that they believed before the PCA and everything, before the arrest, that it was a he. So she's right on point with a lot of things right here.
At any rate, I would say 1 to answer your question. I think we're looking at 1, but I wouldn't rule out 2. It would be much harder, I think, to commit this with 2. And I would have thought there'd be more evidence of like footsteps, leaving, or footprints leaving the house. I always wondered why they didn't, because I think there was a light snow that night, and that would have been important. Yeah, I was going to add to what Gary said that he might even have a whole host of knives. I remember one case that I did when they turned the mattress over. Incredible number of knives were right under the mattress. It was his. He was very proud of that, but yet he didn't show it.
And see, that was interesting. That was an interesting comment on her behalf, because we've never been informed of whether they gathered evidence with a substantial amount of knives or a knife collection in either location of where he was living, either in his home or the apartment or in his parents' home. So that would be interesting because, people have came after me when I had said, well, maybe the reason the knife wounds were different was because there was more than one knife used. And people were like, no, there's no way, blah, blah, blah. It was only one knife. It was a K-bar, this and that and the other. But I thought that at the very beginning is like, why would you go in with just one sort of weapon into a house? What if that knife gets knocked from you? What if it dulls and breaks or whatever? I mean, are you going to still use a dull or broken? I mean, you probably use a dull knife, but you wouldn't use one that broke off. And then what would you do? How would you defend yourself against other people that could potentially be in that home?
He didn't like have it on the wall or like some people would display their things. So that might be something that is looked for if they ever get a suspect of what type of. They keep saying it's a single blade, fixed blade. I don't know why they're saying that, but at any rate, that's the only information we have on the knife. But it's missing. And I think Gary's right. I think it was taken. It was kept with him. I think he would find it. It's not the type that would just throw it away.
And talk about the point that Dr. Mercado made about potentially the token aspect. Do you believe he could have not only taken his own knife, but other items from the potential crime scene?
I would suspect he has, right. And it would be, again, people would have to know what they had, but the most common thing is to take like a license that has a picture on it. It could be a school badge kind of thing, or something that, especially if it was targeted, especially if it was one person, which they seem to be talking about, that there is one person.
Yeah,
isn't that amazing how she stated that? And we later heard that there was IDs that were found in a sock at his parents' home. How they would have got there, unless he took them on his trip with his father and unloaded all this from his luggage. That's the only way that I could have seen that could have gotten there. But at the same time, the fact that she's talking about a token of a killer taking something from the crime scene to remember the crime long after the effects of it wear off. And I thought that was amazing on her part. But we haven't been told one way or the other if any of the victims were indeed in that sock. But there was assumption that there could have been an idea of some sort that tied back to the victim very early on, but we haven't been told, of course.
Dennis Rader. Didn't Dennis Rader do that? BTK. He took Fox's driver's license, if I remember right.
A lot of them kept driver's license. Yeah.
Interesting.
And then they would relive the crime. They go over and over. So all four, you'd have to look to see if there was anything. He certainly has killed before, but I think he's killed animals and really practiced there. Make me curious about what kind of work he may have done or is doing that involves knives or that kind of activity.
There's another point. We found out that he worked at a fish place where they would, fillet fish once they came to the market. Regardless of what his boss said, he wasn't very good at it. He still did it. So not being very good and still being able to do it are two different things. So if you understand the concept of using a knife, this individual could have been proficient with the knife due to this aspect. Were there animals that they found out later on that were killed around the family home? Did animals go missing around that area? Did they find carcasses that were filleted or, and I'm not trying to be gruesome here, but, it is true crime. So did they find animals that were, mutilated? Anything like this, as what she's saying as well. It's quite amazing.
Whether he has actually killed humans is not clear, but what I think is clear is he's going to do it again. When the fantasy fades, when some of the talk of the case kind of fades, and he's not able to keep the fantasy alive, that would be a critical time. And I will say, to back up what Dean said, we do have information from you, Chris, if you will, on the area and how remote it was and how you took the video of that, because it's as important. If you want to catch a suspect, you got to find out where he is. So how does he get out of the house? Where does he go? Is he in the community, or is he from another community, or does he have a car, et cetera, et cetera? All of those could be looked at that are not part of the crime scene. So that I think that with all of the investigation you all have done, that would be really, really important to look at. And nobody seems to be talking about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, the dynamic of that was one way in, one way out. Once you turn left on that street, it's a pretty, contained environment.
I'm just going to say that what we do know about many of the killers is they're very bright. So that their IQ, at least that's what we found in the majority were. I don't know whether Gary can comment on his sample, but they're very bright and they're able to plan and carry it out and get away with it, which is yeah. I wanted to follow up on Dean's question on the incel. There is not a lot of research going on. It is something that we are looking at. I have found a study that looked at 250 incels. But it looks like there are many, many incels out there. They have their own groups, and social media is evidently pretty populated with it. But there are groups that do not get into the violence. So I think that's
a strong statement itself about the incels not getting into violence. I mean, we've heard that there have been some incels that do necessarily pull out crimes against others, but usually these individuals use a firearm, not a knife. So that's a strong point right there that she just made as well.
The good news, if you will, but there certainly is a group that doesn't. We have 25 cases that we're going to look at in more depth to see where there has either been a murder, that they have murdered and then they suicide. Absolutely follows what Gary's research has shown. And then there's some others that they were able to arrest for other crimes before they became violent. So it's a very interesting area that has not been well researched and really needs it. And I think that's where law enforcement would need to get up to speed a bit on that type of offender. Not sure whether it's a new typology or whether it's an expansion of what we have seen before. That's something that we really want to look at. I have a contact, a journalist, Greg Haropian, who is out on the West Coast. And he is in good contact, frequent contact with Ed Kemper. And we wanted to know if Ed, when he went to see him, whether Ed Kemper would be able to weigh in on it, not knowing whether he, watches any of this or whatever. And so Greg did talk with him, spent some time, took some scenes out. The only things I could take him, because you could take it into the prison, were outside pictures, of course, pictures of the house, and anything that was on the website. So Greg had a series to take in. And so one of the comments that Ed Kemper said is, he said, and I'll just read from the notes. Greg said, I showed him photos of the victims. We sent pictures of the victims and the house. And he said his first comment was the house was really weird looking. And in a way it is. It's a very unusual looking house.
So did you hear what she just said? This individual has pictures of the victims and the house. And he showed somebody who's locked up those pictures. So she's about to describe what that individual said. This is interesting stuff right here.
And so that's what caught his attention initially. And then he wanted to know whose cars were parked out there, which of course were the victims' cars, as I understand it. And then he said the skinned dog corpse found nearby might not have been because of the murder. It could have been done by a wannabe.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, I know what that was. And then he said, if law enforcement had tried to speak to Ed through the media, we wanted to know that question, he wouldn't have responded. He said, any evidence is evidence. And if you have no choice but to leave evidence during a crime and you don't want to add to it. And then Greg talked to Ed about a time when he had left himself in one of his crimes, a footprint that had been left in the mud with his size 15 boot, and how he decided not to create more footprints by climbing back down the embankment to try to erase it. So he was very aware, Ed Kemper was very aware of evidence and leaving evidence and what he would or would not do.
That is phenomenal, what she just said. If you happen to leave some type of evidence behind, you don't add to that evidence. So the fact that this individual left the knife sheaths, many people have been stuck on that from the very beginning, stating that there's no way he would have left the knife sheath. He would have went back and got it. It was planted. There's no way it was there. Blah 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 blah. So, in her interpretation, based on this killer that's in prison stating this stuff, there's no way that you'd go back to retrieve something that you left, because then you'd potentially be leaving more evidence. So let's say Koberger did go back to get the knife sheath, as it's been assumed that he returned back to the crime scene around 9:30 a.m. He would have left more evidence trying to go back and get the knife sheath than just leaving it. And I'm sure if he left it and realized it, he probably thought, instead of being in a panic like many people assume, he probably thought, I was wearing gloves. There's no way that there's any fingerprints on it. I have the knife, so there's no way that, they can trace anything back to me. Almost a perfect crime in his mind, I would say. And, that's an interesting statement she just made. This woman is very, very smart.
Now, Ed, of course, for those of you who maybe don't know, he would always kill in pairs. Not always, but usually killed in pairs. Killed his grandparents, killed co-eds in pairs, and killed his mother and her friend. So that there was this kind of thought of multiple victims. And he, I think the other interesting thing about Ed is there was a printout that he had decided that he would move from just what he said, just killing co-eds, and then start mass killing. He had already thought of killing mass, and that's when he turned himself in. So the other thing that Ed Kemper did, of course, was to decapitate the victims and cut their hands off. And that was because in those days, don't forget, it was just DNA or fingerprints that they would go after. And he thought he could, he was doing.
Well, of course, we know that, or at least what we've been told, is none of the victims were decapitated or any of their hands were, cut off. The only thing that we really heard about any of that could have been like, Xana fighting back and her fingers almost being, taken off. But was that during the struggle, or was that intentional? You know what I mean? Like, we don't know. We don't know if she managed to grab any hair, scratch the individual. We don't know any of that. So, if there's any DNA under the victim's fingernails, on their hands, on their body, any trace DNA, any of that, it would definitely come out in trial.
Some way of
So he was thinking ahead of the investigators.
Yeah.
During,
yes.
Post-crime, post-incident behavior.
Right. And he would try to insert himself into the investigations, don't forget. He would sit with the police, and ask how things were going. He said he was a friendly nuisance, the police.
And of course, we've heard of Papa Rogers, We've heard of inside looking, on the Reddit post, and the individuals giving, you know, um, almost play by play of what went down before the individual was caught, which we later found out was more true than not. So was this Brian inserting himself into the crime scene investigation, so to speak, in either one of those? Or was this law enforcement trying to fish the person out on the social media? I mean, all this stuff is quite intriguing, and I'm sure we'll know, or we may never know, if this was him or not.
So to answer your question, yes, people are talking about it, but evidently in the prisons, he only has access to local news. So he did not know anything about this. That's why Greg had to take photos in.
What's fascinating is these guys are weighing in.
Yeah.
Right? When they're asked, they're weighing in, which, this has been in your wheelhouse, for many, many years. They really are, when you sit down with them, some of them are very likable, but they're so evil on the other side of that persona. Sorry, Ann.
Yeah. I think that the social media issue is huge. And I hope that they have examined the hard drives of the victims to see whether any messages came in or whatever. But that gets into the profiling. And what do we think? Would he be under an assumed name, et cetera? I think Gary also brought out after podcasts like this that there can be a lot of very interesting.
And a question that I have about that, and people have posed this question, but they've never really delved deeper than the question is, was he communicating with these individuals from Pennsylvania before he even came out there? Was he interacting with any of these individuals via social media? Was he surveying them, so to speak, from afar? And due to the FBI getting involved in all this, could that be partial to the digital evidence that they're working on? Did they work on a case? They build up a case on Brian, as we later found out he was the one arrested for this crime. Were they building up a case with him? Once they arrested him, once they got his towers, his computer towers, and everything, was there anything in there that implicated him, past, present, that showed interaction with any of these victims, any of the housemates that survived, anybody correlated with any of these victims? Did he know anybody through 6 degrees of separation? I mean, was he able to keep tabs on these people without them even knowing he was keeping tabs? I mean, were there any cameras placed around the residence that they may have found? I mean, was there any areas where it showed that he's like Dr. Bricado and Chris mentioned in another podcast, how he have been able to tap into the computer um, of the victims and virtually watch them through their laptops or their desktops, their cell phones, anything like that? I mean, because we know that this is possible. So, was he able to decipher the password to the home? Did he try to interject anything digitally in order to survey the victims? Because people get caught up on the stalking. There's two different things. Police survey the perpetrators, they don't stalk them. So there might have not have been any stalking, but doesn't mean there wasn't any surveying. Well, I think this was an excellent interview.
Call in.
And Chris, if you watch this, thank you for your interview with the individual that was just on their panel, I wish I would have gotten her name, at least wrote it down. And I'm giving Chris McDonough credence for that interview. The interview room, obviously, with the panel of experts. And right now, I'm going to go back and I'm going to talk about something that I did on the live earlier. And I'm going to break it down with just me discussing it, okay? Because I talked about this earlier on a live, and there was a lot of, I don't know, there was just a lot of stimuli that was keeping me unfocused from what I was trying to say. Because I had read this and I had looked at it, and I had some points that I wanted to make on it, but for some reason there was a lot going on and I was unable to focus because of that. So that's why I chose to do it like this, because this gives me the opportunity to be able to focus on the material rather than focusing on everything else that's going on. This is how police actually cracked the Idaho killing case. Investigators used forensic genealogy to zero in on suspect Brian Koberger, but they aren't saying so. This was January 10th, 2023. So December 25th, 2022 with the video we just watched, and this is January 10th, 2023. So this is after the arrest. So this is before the gag order. It says around 4 a.m. on November 13th, a masked man broke into a house about a mile from the University of Idaho campus and stabbed 4 students. Then he walked past the stunned surviving roommate and left. By the time police arrived, Kaylee Gonsalves, Madison Mogan, Ethan Chapin, and Jana Carnodo were dead. Early on in the investigation, the Moscow Police Department became interested in a white Hyundai Elantra that surveillance footage had captured near the house that morning. So let's look at that for a minute, because I know in a lot of other people's shows, they're trying to debunk that Hyundai Elantra, saying that it wasn't there, didn't exist, all these things. So if you're looking into this crime scene and you notice the cameras that are around that area, because they obviously did a digital dump of all the camera footage, and they noticed a white Elantra at the time of the murders, okay? And you notice that this Elantra, you're looking at this Elantra, it doesn't have a front license plate. It obviously appears to be caught on camera more than once. And once again, people focus on the fact that they said an 11 to 13. You know, these individuals, I don't know if they really believe that, you know, since police got the years wrong, that they got the case wrong. I can't speak for them, but they seem to really think that way. So if you're not wanting to tip off the potential suspect, are you going to tell them that you got the year of their car? Just like what we were talking about a while ago, as far as tipping off the individual, are you going to tell them what you have on them so that they can try to outsmart you or even get rid of the car, burn the car, sell the car, any of this stuff? Because obviously the individual is trying not to get caught, right? They've acted out their fantasy. They've acted out their urge to kill. Whether or not they've kept souvenirs is to be seen. But think about it. They said 13 to or 11 to 13 so that people would start looking for Hyundai Elantras. And then later on, as they closed in on him, that's when they increased the years. So police compiled a list of white Hyundai Elantras spanning from 11 to 16 that were registered in local universities and instructed officers to search for still more. An affidavit released last week revealed that on November 29th, just 2 weeks after the crime, these techniques succeeded in identifying a 2015 Elantra registered to Brian Koberger, a 28-year-old criminology student at nearby Washington State University. And still, people have questions. They said, "Well, how of all the Elantras that they gathered info on, how did they focus on his?" Well, think of it like this. Up until he changed from Pennsylvania plates to Washington plates, he only had one license plate on his vehicle. That was the back one. So of all the Elantra that you're looking for, obviously that is a big clue. We're looking for an Elantra without a front license plate. So of all the Elantra that you're finding, you're doing surveillance, you're asking questions, you're asking around, where were you on this night? Where were you during these times? I'm sure it was a small list, but still, he wasn't on it yet. They weren't convinced that his vehicle was the one they were looking for. And you're going to hear that in this next paragraph. It says, and yet it would be another month before police arrested Koberger and charged him with the murders. All the while, investigators would keep pleading for more tips about Elantras. That's because it was not Koberger's Elantra that had elevated him to a priority person of interest. So he wasn't even really being looked at. They may have known that he had an Elantra, but he wasn't a person of interest. Rather, according to law enforcement source familiar with the investigation with whom I spoke, a key reason police focus on Koberger as a likely suspect to do with something that is never mentioned in the 18-page affidavit, forensic genealogy. It was only after investigators utilized technique reliant on genealogy databases to determine who'd left DNA on a tan leather knife sheath that police requested a search warrant for Koberger's phone records. According to that source, up until that point in late December, he hadn't stood out among all other Elantra owners, the source said, something that is reinforced by a close informed reading of the affidavit. So it wasn't until the genealogy came back that they started really pinpointing on names that they were given. So obviously his name was given due to the tan leather knife sheath, the DNA that was left. So when you're piecing together this evidence, okay, now we're going to look at this. Now we're going to go with this. So they requested his phone records. Where were you during the time of the murders? The precise way forensic genealogy helped investigators zero in on Koberger hasn't been previously reported. This is one of the most high-profile cases in which the relatively new, ethically contentious method has been used so soon after a crime has been committed, and it will likely influence how law enforcement approaches it going forward. Though multiple news outlets, including CNN and ABC News, reported that forensic genealogy helped with the case, none has explained how it was used or why it did not appear in the affidavit. And that is another thing that people focus on, is the fact that if they used the genealogy, how come they didn't mention it in the affidavit? Because the simple fact is they didn't need to. They didn't need to. They had other circumstantial evidence that gave them reasonable cause, probable cause to get an arrest warrant. That's all the PCA is. You show me evidence that beyond a reasonable doubt that this could more than likely be the perp, then we're going to go arrest them. And then we're going to go through the process to see if there's enough evidence to indict them. And that's how it works. It's not, okay, well, we found later on that there wasn't enough evidence. The PCA sounded crazy. It sounded like a theory. It sounded like all these things going on. Well, it can sound how it wants to you. But when you look at it and you break it down, you actually know what it's about. That's all it's about. Probable cause. That how and why matters. For one thing, it shows that a method known mostly for solving cold cases can apply to ones that are still hot. That may increase demand for an emerging field that was already experiencing a boom. The use of forensic genealogy also underlines that the current storyline about how police identify their suspect, which some are suggesting is a model, of missing pivotal details. According to numerous genetic genealogists, the case embodies an emerging trend of leaving out any mention of forensic genealogy from court documents and press conferences. Once again, would you want this information out in the public if, what's the purpose? What's the purpose of telling people in the public how you found him? You know, they were very tight lipped in this because they kept saying, we want to do this one time, we want to do it right. So, not long after they did this, they put the gag order on it because they didn't want to explain. And I could see how that looks suspicious. I could look how you would say, well, they're trying to hide something. But at the same time, the police are not obligated to tell the public every little piece that's going on in an investigation. We don't have to know, regardless of what other creators tell you, because they're looking for a perpetrator. Now, if the perpetrator was caught in the act and he's in custody, that's a total different situation. That's when you usually get the whole situation that went on. This person was not in custody. So they're releasing as little as possible. And even afterward, they wanted to show you, look, this is all we really had at the point, but this is how we sped up our investigative process by this genealogy. The Idaho affidavit's thoughtful omission of any reference to genealogy, as forensic DNA analyst Tiffany Roy put it, has reignited a heated debate among investigative genealogists, lawyers, detectives, and other forensic experts about the wisdom of the strategy. The people involved in Koberger's arrest won't be weighing in anytime soon. On January 3rd, shortly after Moscow police announced the arrest, a judge in Idaho issued a gag order prohibiting anyone involved in the case from speaking about it in order to encourage a fair trial. This order also applied to Koberger's defense team, which did not respond to a request for comment. Koberger is expected to appear in court again on Thursday. So think about this a little bit. We've been hearing that from day one. We want a fair trial. We want a fair trial. We want a fair trial. Well, the defense's strategy is obviously not about a fair trial. They're wanting to show you that there were inconsistencies, there was these inability to conduct the case appropriately. They wanted to put the police detective that investigated the case up on a hearing stand. They wanted to already show incompetence. So how is that a fair trial? Well, the defense didn't really speak. They didn't really ask questions. Because if you start getting into that whole back and forth, why do you need a trial if you're going to do it without a jury? And she knew what she was doing. The jury wasn't in the room, so she could ask any question and they could answer any way they wanted. It has no basis on the outcome of the trial. So, all the stuff that y'all been hearing and reposting about the trial or about the motion hearings, that's all that was procedure. They're talking fair trial, but is it really fair if one side gets to speak all the time and the other doesn't answer? But yet you're assuming that based on the silence that the other side is trying to hide something. That is strategy. That is not reality. That is strategy. This order also applied to Koberger's defense team, which did not respond to requests for comment. Hyundai Elantras are among the best-selling cars in America. White is among the most common car colors, and so it is not surprising that within 24 hours of requesting tips about the white Elantra on his Facebook page on December 7th, the Moscow Police Department had received so many that they had to devise a new system for accepting them. By December 27th, the agency had a list of 22,000 white Elantras. One of the ways investigators whittled down the vehicle's owners was by looking for associated mobile phones that pinged cell towers near the crime scene around the time of the murder. Koberger failed to stand out in that way, according to the affidavit, because his was turned off. So think about that statement right there. If you have this white Elantra, because people have also said there could have been two. So if there was another, if the DoorDash driver was driving one Elantra, they would have got his cell phone data, right? They would have seen if his pinged, obviously, near the crime scene. Well, if he were delivering food or groceries or whatever at 4 a.m., his would have pinged. But you don't think that if he did drive an Elantra, he wouldn't have been at the top of the list? Koberger wouldn't have even had a blip on the radar yet. And since we're talking about DoorDash, I wanna put this out there. It is assumption, and I'm still looking. I haven't read the PCA in a while, so I don't know if it specifically states that she ordered food on DoorDash. But food on DoorDash can mean groceries. It can mean something from the grocery store. It doesn't necessarily mean restaurant. And I got to thinking about that because DoorDash delivers more than just fast food. At least they do around here. And I've heard that the Winco would have been the only thing open at that time. So did the DoorDash driver go to the Winco and get some groceries for Xena? Because as people are saying, well, if they were eating pizza at midnight, why would she have ordered DoorDash at 4 a.m.? Think about that a minute. She could have ordered food for breakfast the next day or brunch. Maybe they didn't have orange juice. Maybe they didn't have eggs or sausage or whatever. You just don't know. Food is food, whether it's cooked or whether it's not. And I think we'll hear about that in the trial as well. So I got to thinking about that. So I thought I'd share it with you guys. So let's get back to this. A query of the 8458 phone and these returned did not show the 8458 phone utilizing cell tower resources in close proximity to the King Road residence between 3 and 5 a.m. Brett Payne, Moscow Police Department's lead investigator, wrote, referring to Koberger's phone. Of course, because it was off. So he didn't lie. He didn't say, well, his phone pinged during that time, so that's how we got him. Many people are assuming that that's how they got onto him, was his cell phone at 2:47 before he turned it off. What was likely meant was that there was no immediate response to prioritize Koberger over other Elantra owners. So even at this point, you're still not a blip on their screen. If you remember, this investigation took a minute. It wasn't like they went from the 13th to the 17th and arrested him. It wasn't that quick, so it took some time to do some investigative work. They had to call in other people to assist them because there was so much to look through. On December 23rd, 3 weeks after Koberger's Elantra first made the list, Payne applied for a search warrant for records of Koberger's phone activity between November 12th and 14th. The results helped convince Payne that Koberger was the Elantra owner he was looking for after all. So you go and you apply for the search warrant, and you notice this individual left his home at 2:47. So you go looking for cameras around his home. Oh, there's the white Elantra. No front license plate. And then it suddenly goes off the map. And then it reappears back at whatever time, 4:28. And you have some camera views down there. And oh, it's a white Elantra with no front license plate. What are the odds? And I'm not saying that they're high, but what are the odds of that happening at that time of morning? Because these are how things are done. You're deep diving into all this. It's almost like writing a paper. There's an outline of a formula that you're using in order to get your suspect. There's headers. White Elantra, no license, no front license plate. Out at between 2 and 5. And then you go looking at the cameras. And you notice that this individual's white Elantra is moving right along per the PCA. And then all of a sudden the phone is off. And then all of a sudden the phone is back on south of the murder scene. Okay, so you do some more investigating. So you got a miss area between the time the individual left his home, the murders happened, and then the time he turned his phone back on. Where was he? Did you catch him on any other cameras? Was there any gas purchases? Was there any receipts? Was there anything that could show him still in the area while his phone was off? So you're looking for all this evidence to document your perception of him being the one. Okay, so the route of travel of the 8458 phone during the early morning hours of November 13, 2022, and the lack of the 8458 phone reporting to AT&T between 2:47 and 4:48 is consistent with Koberger attempting to conceal his location during the quadruple homicide that occurred at the King Road residence, he wrote. And people have stated, why didn't Koberger just leave his phone at home? What was on that phone that he needed to look at? Were there pictures of the house? Were there pictures of the location that he needed to go? Or did he have that memorized? What was on that phone that he needed that phone? Even though it wasn't on, he still needed that phone. He had been to Moscow, so it's not like he didn't know the way. What was on that phone that he needed to bring the phone with him? How come he couldn't have just left it on his dresser on, and we might not even be having this discussion. So the question is, what happened shortly before Christmas to refocus Payne's attention on this particular Elantra owner? The answer, according to the source familiar with the investigation, is partly that the officer got back the results for, from a forensic genealogy team. As court documents state, during the exploration of the house, Payne found a leather knife sheath stamped with a Marine Corps eagle containing a single source of male DNA on his button snap. Had the suspect been arrested for or convicted of a felony in one of the states that they're aggressive about collecting DNA, officials might have found him by searching a criminal database. But Koberger's most notable previous interaction with police occurred this past fall when he applied for an internship to work for Pullman Police Department. So anytime that you apply, and I'm only stating on experience here because I've worked with law enforcement agencies and other entities, parole, probation. Anytime you get to working for somebody that contract to these areas, your fingerprints are ran. They're ran all the way up to the FBI, making sure you don't have any kind of crimes or any warrants or anything that they could, disqualify you for. So obviously you didn't have anything, right? But they still had his fingerprints. So they say, well, if there was his fingerprints at the crime scene, they would have caught him based on his fingerprints. Who's to say that they didn't find his fingerprints? And that was just another piece of evidence to use along with the genealogy. So now you got two pieces of evidence placing him in the home: the genealogy and the fingerprints. So to assume that there were no fingerprints because they would have caught him based on that, maybe they didn't. Like it said, he wasn't a person of interest at this point. He didn't become a person of interest until the genealogy. And then you're matching up fingerprints and you're saying, oh, let's get these fingerprints that we did find and see if there's any matches. I mean, it takes a lot of time to do all this stuff. So to say, oh, remember that dude that applied? Wasn't his name Koberger? Yeah, let's look at his fingerprint card. Holy shit, it matches up. Now we're really building a case on this guy. It just doesn't happen overnight. So just because they didn't match up the fingerprints immediately, because he wasn't in CODIS, and why would they go looking at their own records to try to catch a killer? That doesn't make sense. Why would they be looking in their own database to see if anybody in their place of work or application would have been the killer? That doesn't make sense. You wouldn't do that until you found a name and then you cross reference. And then somebody says, oh, we had a guy that applied with that last name. Let's look at his fingerprint. And bam, it's a match. It matches the fingerprints that are found at the house, along with the genealogy. So it said a single source of male DNA on the button snap. Had the suspect been arrested for or convicted of a felony in one of the states that are aggressive about collecting DNA, officials might have found him searching a criminal database. But Koberger's most notable previous interaction with police occurred this past fall when he applied for an internship to work for the Pullman Police Department. And so in the end, investigators would turn to an alternative way of identifying DNA, which rose to the prominence following 2018 arrest of Joseph James D'Angelo a former police officer in what's widely referred to as the Golden State Killer case. After decades of dead ends, investigators helped triangulate the identity of the mystery man who terrorized California in the 70s and 80s, committing at least 13 murders and many more rapes by using partial genetic matches to relatives and genealogy databases and the building of an enormous family tree. Since then, law enforcement agencies across the country have used the technique to identify suspects and victims in hundreds of cases. Most of these cases went cold decades ago, but regardless how long a lab had been storing the DNA, a first step involved processing the DNA in a way that enables an upload to a genealogy database. This is not something police labs can do because genealogists rely on a different, essentially far more informative type of DNA analysis, said Samantha Blatt, a biological anthropologist at Idaho State University who has worked on forensic genealogy cases in Idaho. Idaho State Police has a contract with Othram, a forensic genealogy company, to conduct genealogy testing, according to a July 2020 memo. Othram and Idaho State Police Forensic Services declined to comment. Once the DNA profile is ready, it gets uploaded to GED Match or Family Tree DNA, if not both. These are two primary genealogy sites that permit some types of law enforcement searches. So I would be willing to assume that these are two that they use more often than not. Many people have been under the assumption that they use 23andMe or Ancestry.com, which doesn't allow police to look through their database. So obviously these two do. So why wouldn't you use the ones that allow you to rather than the ones that don't? The FBI played a role in the forensic genealogy work in the Idaho case, according to the source familiar with the investigation, something several genealogists confirmed would be likely to happen in such a high-profile investigation. The FBI declined to comment, and Anthony Dollinger, a spokesperson for Moscow Police Department, wrote, "Due to the gag order issued by the judge, I'm not allowed to discuss the case in any form." Regardless of who is conducting the investigation, genealogists look for partial matches, hoping to find relatives within the third cousin range. They then begin the process of building an enormous family tree using a vast array of public records and more traditional detective work to create a short list of people within the tree that would plausibly be the suspect. The fact that Koberger lived 10 miles from the crime scene would have helped him stand out. So too would the fact that he owned a white Elantra. So there's two more pieces that connect this individual. You see a white Elantra leaving Pullman at 2:47. You pick him up again at 4:28. You see him at an Albertson. You see him buy a cup of Joe. You see him by this other coffee shop heading out of Moscow. Even if that has been stated that wasn't true, that's what the PCA said. Still, even after pulling the phone record, the team had no way to be certain Koberger's DNA would match the knife sheath DNA. So they're still questioning this. After pulling those phone records, they still didn't know, or they were certain that his DNA would match the knife sheath. So people just say that, oh my God, they were just focusing in on him and him alone, and they targeted him, and he was a patsy, and all this other stuff. They still weren't certain. A genetic genealogy lead is just a hypothesis, not a. That's all it is, after all. A final step typically involves conducting surveillance on the suspect and then collecting something they've discarded, such as a cigarette butt or soda can, extracting DNA from it and comparing with the crime scene DNA. So they say, well, how come they didn't get his DNA? How come they didn't bring him in and swab his cheek, ask him for a DNA swab? How come they didn't get something from his home, trash or anything like that? Because the individual sorted his trash with gloves. He probably, at this point, knew that this was a major way to connect him to anything, and he probably wore gloves a lot of the time. What I don't understand, well, he wasn't back at teaching very long, so he could have wore gloves in his office. You know, he might have kept one pen or discarded the pen in a place that nobody could find it. I mean, if you're going to go above and beyond to not be caught, you're going to do things out of the ordinary where people normally don't think about the look. You know, you could have traded a pen off with a coworker. Here you go. I'll give you a pen. There. You got you gave the pen to that person, so if your fingerprints or DNA is on it, hey, it's on their pen, you know? It's not on your pen alone. Um a genetic genealogy lead is just a hypothesis, just like I said. On December 27th, agents collected trash from outside the Pennsylvania home where Koberger was visiting his parents. So they had to wait until this long. According to the affidavit, the Idaho State Lab reported that there was an extremely high probability it contained DNA belonging to the suspect's father. On December 30th, agents arrested Koberger. So by this point, they already had Kobergers, and they needed something collaborating from the family that this was the right person. And they got his dad match, and bam, they arrested him. Soon after Koberger appeared in front of a judge in Idaho, the court released the affidavit. Some suggested that the absence of any reference to forensic genealogy meant that it had not been utilized at all. But there's another explanation. Forensic genealogy leaders at the FBI and beyond have directed police departments to omit all references to the technique. Numerous people involved in the investigation told me the only reason it would show up in a probable cause document or search warrant these days is if the police department rejected their guidance. So, had the police department not wanted the FBI's help, you would have seen it in the affidavit. That answers that question that many have, that many continue to ask. Why wasn't it in the affidavit? How come it wasn't mentioned? Well, there's your answer. Whether you want to take that at face value or you don't, there is your answer. As to whether keeping it out of court documents is a problem, two primary camps have emerged over the past few days. The first camp says leaving it out is offensive. The technique relies on members of the public who've chosen to opt out or opt in to genealogy databases to allow law enforcement to use their DNA profiles to help identify their relatives. Therefore, the public deserves to know when it's used. Contrary to what many people think, Ancestry and 23andMe don't easily enable law enforcement searches. So GED match and family tree DNA are what we're talking about here. So we've heard about Ancestry, we've heard about 23andMe. That's what people keep saying, that they used those websites to get to him. No, they did not, obviously, because they don't allow you to go through their database that easily. These other two do. So chances are that's where they got it. Because it's not these in the court documents, it's difficult to know how many times it's been used or the kind of cases in which law enforcement applies it. Why hide it? Asked George Hampikian, a biology professor at Boise State University who is also the director of the Idaho Innocence Project. Having worked on two cases in Idaho in which forensic genealogy helped clear two people who were wrongfully convicted of murder. He knows firsthand that the fundamental science is solid and the technique is valuable, but he's observed that the longer a novel forensic method stays hidden, the more room there is for errors in its application. Let's go get it tested in court and let's see the public and let them know about it, he said. Roy, the forensic DNA analyst, made similar posts in a LinkedIn post that sparked a fiery debate over the weekend. In a follow-up interview, Roy noted that when investigators get a DNA hit in CODIS, the FBI's criminal database, they typically mention it in the affidavit. Getting a partial match in a genealogy database should be similarly included. Early on, prominent forensic genealogists and database managers allowed genetic profiles to be searched in ways that violated customer service agreements. So in the past, they used to do it. The investigators also lied to relatives of people they found through the database. She believes that more scrutiny is needed to ensure police don't abuse their power, and she dismisses the argument that keeping the technique out of affidavits protect the privacy of the suspect's family members because police have already used this information. They're using privacy as a shield and a sword at the same time, she said. The second camp says that these people need to chill out because an affidavit of probable cause is supposed to explain why police believe someone is their suspect, not how they arrived to that conclusion. You don't typically include anonymous tips or internet searches in the document. This isn't that different. The interest given that you would never use a genetic genealogy lead to arrest someone, only to take the next step and collect DNA from them to compare with the crime scene example. And since an investigative genetic genealogy or IgG lead is not direct evidence, there's no reason for the jury to hear about the lead generated by IgG. The director of the Investigative Genealogy Center at Ramapo College, who is also part of a group that is developing standards for investigative genetic genealogists. Several prominent genealogists told me they agreed with him. So since you're not using this as evidence, you're using this as a tip on how you got to the person. It's a fine line. It's a fine line. Some within the second camp agree with the first camp that transparency is important, but affidavits are not the place for it, they say. See, I would agree with that more than anything. Transparency is needed. You need to put it out there, but it's not necessarily needed in the affidavit if you have more evidence compiled to demonstrate that this could probably be your client or your suspect more than not. One strange consequence of the current policy is that even Kohberger's relatives may never know that their DNA profiles contributed to his arrest. That's because most genealogists' approach is not to tell them. If they are distant cousins, they might not recognize his name. Several genealogists I talked to made the case that people would rather not know that they're related to suspected killers and rapists. John Hogan, a death investigator and business owner in Lowndes County, Georgia, disagrees. Hogan learned that his DNA profile helped arrest a second cousin for murder in 2019 only after a reporter told him. If they took one time to use something that is a part of me, I need to know that something that is a part of me is used, he said in a phone interview. All these are sorts of issues Kohberger had planned to spend the next few years studying. Washington State University even offered a course examining the implications of forensic genealogy. It's worth remembering that a jury could find Kohberger to be innocent regardless. It's unlikely he'll enter a classroom soon. So I thought that was very interesting, to say the least. And like they just said, he could be innocent. And he could have been preparing to use his field study, so to speak, as future topics to discuss to see how his students would be able to solve this crime. But we may or may never know. And I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, please hit the like button and subscribe if you aren't already a subscriber. One thing that I aim to do on my channel is not to cause a lot of drama, not to cause a lot of arguments or fighting or I'm right, you're wrong. I believe that there isn't a place for it, especially when I'm trying to give information that you yourself are able to take and decipher and use. So I have a disclaimer. If you come into the chat, please stick to the topic that's being discussed rather than putting out things that have not been proven as factual information, things that have not been brought out by the police or other agencies, because it just distracts the chat and it distracts the presenters because they're trying to engage with you, but yet they may never have seen you before. They don't know how you meant that, whether you meant it, in a malicious manner, whether you were being aggressive, whether you were just making a statement. The one thing about the subs that show up into the chat on a daily basis or when I go live is I've grown to know their mannerisms. I've grown to know their statements or how they speak based on their wording. So when people come in here and they make statements and I've never seen them before, it's hard to decipher that. Heck, I can't even tell if it's a female or a male most of the time. So it's a little frustrating because you don't know how to respond to these individuals because you've never seen them before. You've never interacted with them before. You don't know what their stance is on the case. So the fact that I say that everybody's opinion matters, that's what I mean by that. But you have to be interactive in the chat more than one time every 3 weeks. You know what I mean? So I don't mean any disrespect to anybody who comes into the chat or try to give me their opinion. But all I ask is maybe you might come into the chat a little more on cases that don't involve the IDAHO4 case so I can learn who you are, what you're about, and where your stance is on true crime. That way, when you do come in on the IDAHO4 case, it's not such a big mystery on where you stand in life, your beliefs, your morals, your values. And that's all I really have to say about that. I thank you so much for visiting, and I hope that y'all have a wonderful Sunday. We'll see you soon.